Denver, Colorado, 1899. The winter of 1899 cast a pale shroud over Denver as Miguel Ortega trudged through the snow-laden streets, his worn boots sinking into the fresh powder with each deliberate step. The coal smoke from countless chimneys hung in the air, creating a hazy veil that obscured the Rocky Mountains to the west. His calloused hands, cracked from years of labor in the silver mines, clutched a small, weathered Bible, a gift from his mother before he had left Mexico 5 years prior. The neighborhood of Ortega had become home to a growing community of Mexican laborers who had come north seeking work in the mines and on the railroads. Miguel had been one of the first, establishing himself as a respected member of the community, a man whose word carried weight, which is why the burden he now carried felt all the heavier. His wife, Isabella, had given birth to their 5th child just 3 days ago, a boy they named Antonio. The 4 previous children had all died before their first birthdays, victims of fevers, coughs, and ailments that swept through the crowded tenements with brutal efficiency. Miguel crossed himself as he passed the small cemetery where 4 tiny wooden crosses bore the Ortega name. "Señor Ortega," called a voice from the doorway of a narrow brick building. Father Dominguez, the parish priest, beckoned him inside. "Come in from the cold. We have much to discuss before the baptism." The church interior was marginally warmer than the street, illuminated by flickering candles that cast long shadows across the worn wooden pews. The scent of incense hung in the air, mingling with the mustiness of old books and the faint metallic tang that Miguel always associated with extreme cold. "I fear for this child, Father," Miguel confessed, removing his hat and clutching it against his chest. 4 children we have lost. 4. Isabella says there is a curse upon our family. Father Dominguez's face remained impassive, though his eyes softened with compassion. "There is no curse, my son, only God's will, which we cannot always understand. With respect, Father, I cannot accept that it is God's will to take all my children." Miguel's voice cracked. "The other men speak of someone who might help, a man they call El Padrino, the Godfather." The priest's expression darkened immediately. "You speak of Thomas Blackwood. He is no godfather, Miguel. The man deals in—" "They say he can ensure the child lives," Miguel interrupted, desperation evident in his voice. "That he has powers." "He has no powers," Father Dominguez said firmly. "Only deceptions and false promises that prey on the desperate. Whatever he offers comes with a price too terrible to contemplate." Miguel looked down at his worn boots, watching as the melting snow formed small puddles on the church floor. "What price could be greater than burying another child, Father?" A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of a train whistle and the soft hiss of candles burning low. "The baptism will be tomorrow at noon," the priest finally said. "Bring the child and your wife. We will ask for God's protection, the only protection that matters." Miguel nodded, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. As he stepped back into the bitter cold, he hesitated on the church steps. To the east lay the path home, to Isabella and their newborn son. To the west, across the rail yards and beyond the respectable parts of town, was the neighborhood known as the Bottoms, where Thomas Blackwood, the man they called El Padrino, was said to receive those in need of services the church could not provide. With a silent prayer for forgiveness, Miguel turned west, the snow quickly covering his tracks as darkness fell over Denver. The Bottoms earned its name honestly. It was the lowest part of Denver in every sense. Built on the floodplain of Cherry Creek, it was where the poorest of the poor made their homes, alongside the gambling dens, brothels, and opium houses that served the baser needs of the city. The buildings leaned precariously, as if they too were beaten down by the circumstances of their existence. Thomas Blackwood's establishment stood apart, a 2-story brick building with clean glass windows and a freshly painted door. A small brass plaque simply read, "T. Blackwood, Consulting." No one seemed to know exactly what Blackwood consulted on, But word had spread through the immigrant communities that he could solve problems that defied conventional solutions. Miguel hesitated at the door, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The last rays of sunlight had disappeared, and gas lamps now illuminated the snow with an eerie yellow glow. He raised his hand to knock, but paused as the door swung open of its own accord. "Mr. Ortega," said a tall, slender man in an impeccably tailored black suit. "I've been expecting you." Thomas Blackwood looked nothing like Miguel had imagined. He had expected someone older, perhaps with the weathered features of a medicine man or the sinister appearance of the villains in penny dreadfuls. Instead, Blackwood appeared to be in his 30s, with sharp, aristocratic features, pale skin, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. "How do you know my name?" Miguel asked, still standing in the doorway. Blackwood smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Denver is a large city that functions like a small town, Mr. Ortega. Word travels, especially word of a man who has buried 4 children and whose wife has just delivered a 5th. He gestured inside. "Please, enter and warm yourself." The interior was unexpectedly elegant. Polished hardwood floors, leather-bound books lining the walls, and a fire crackling in a stone hearth. It seemed more like the study of a wealthy businessman than the lair of a mystic. "Sit," Blackwood said, indicating a leather chair across from his desk. "Would you care for a drink? I have an excellent bourbon." Miguel shook his head. "I have come about my son, Antonio," Blackwood said with a nod. "Born 3 days ago, your 5th child, but the first, you hope, who will live to see his 2nd birthday." Miguel's hands tightened around his hat. "They say you can help, that you can protect him." Blackwood steepled his fingers, studying Miguel with those unnervingly dark eyes. "I can. But as I'm sure you've been told, my services come at a price." "I have money," Miguel said quickly. "I've been saving—" "I have no interest in your money, Mr. Ortega," Blackwood interrupted smoothly. "What I deal in is more valuable than gold or silver." The fire popped loudly in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the eaves like a lost soul. "What then?" Miguel asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Godfather," Blackwood said, leaning back in his chair. "That's what they call me, isn't it? El Padrino. I find it appropriate. What I want, Mr. Ortega, is to be named your son's godfather, officially, at his baptism." Miguel stared at the man in confusion. "That's all? Just to be his godfather?" "In the eyes of your church and your community, yes," Blackwood confirmed. "I will stand beside you at the baptismal font tomorrow, and Father Dominguez will name me Antonio's godfather. In return, I promise you this. Your son will live a long, healthy life." Miguel's brow furrowed with suspicion. "How can you promise such a thing?" Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "Let's just say I have certain influences in this city, enough to ensure that one small boy receives the best of care, the best of food, and protection from the illnesses that claimed his siblings." "And that is all you want? To be his godfather?" "That is all," Blackwood confirmed, "though I should warn you that Father Dominguez will object. He and I have a history. You will need to insist." Miguel nodded slowly, still uncertain. "And if I refuse?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, though the fire continued to burn. Blackwood's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted in those dark eyes, something ancient and hungry. "Then you leave with my sympathies, Mr. Ortega," he said softly. "And you prepare to dig a 5th small grave come spring." Miguel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I should go." "Of course," Blackwood said, rising as well. "You have much to discuss with your wife. But remember, Mr. Ortega, my offer expires at noon tomorrow. Once the baptismal waters have touched your son's head without my presence, there is nothing I can do." "Dean," As Miguel hurried back through the snowy streets, the wind at his back seemed to whisper with Blackwood's voice, following him all the way to the small apartment where Isabella waited with their newborn son. The one-room apartment that Miguel and Isabella called home was located on the third floor of a narrow building that creaked and swayed with every gust of wind. A single coal stove provided meager heat, and frost patterns formed intricate designs on the inside of the windows. Despite the cold, the room was meticulously clean, a testament to Isabella's determination to provide a healthy environment for their new child. Isabella sat in a rocking chair near the stove, cradling Antonio in her arms. At 26, she looked a decade older, her once vibrant beauty dimmed by grief and hardship. Still, as she looked up at Miguel, her dark eyes held the same fierce love that had captured his heart 7 years ago. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Father Dominguez came by. He said you left the church hours ago." Miguel hung his coat on a nail by the door and crossed to the stove, holding his hands out to the warmth. "I went to see him," he said quietly. "The man they call El Padrino." Isabella's eyes widened, and she instinctively held Antonio closer to her chest. "Miguel, no, the priest warned us." "I know what the priest said," Miguel interrupted, kneeling beside her chair. "But Isabella, what if this is our chance, our only chance to save our son?" In the dim light of the coal oil lamp, Miguel recounted his meeting with Thomas Blackwood, the elegant office, the strange man's knowledge of their family, and his unusual request. "He wants nothing more than to be Antonio's godfather," Isabella asked skeptically. "That makes no sense. Why would a rich American businessman want such a connection to a miner's son?" Miguel shook his head. "I don't know, but he promised Antonio would live, would be healthy. And Isabella, I believed him. There was something in his eyes. He has the power to keep his promise. Or to do great harm," Isabella countered. She looked down at their sleeping son, his tiny face peaceful in the glow of the lamp. "Remember what my grandmother used to say about making deals with strange men at crossroads? Some prices are too high, no matter how desperate we are." "What price could be higher than burying another child?" Miguel asked, echoing the question he had posed to Father Dominguez. Isabella reached out and took his hand. "The price of his soul, Miguel, or ours." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the soft breathing of their child, the crackle of the coal in the stove, and the relentless wind outside. 4 small graves haunted them both, 4 tiny wooden crosses that marked the brevity of their children's lives. "The baptism is tomorrow at noon," Miguel finally said. "We must decide by then." Isabella closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I will pray tonight for guidance." Miguel nodded, though in his heart he feared that prayers alone had not been enough to save their other children. Perhaps this time they needed something more. The night passed fitfully for both of them. Miguel lay awake, listening to the occasional cough or whimper from Antonio, each sound sending a spike of fear through his heart. How long before those small coughs turned into the racking, desperate gasps that had taken their daughter Maria? How long before fever flushed his small cheeks as it had taken their son Julio? By morning, dark circles shadowed both their eyes, but a resolution had formed between them, unspoken but understood. They dressed in their Sunday best, wrapped Antonio in the christening gown that had been used by all their children, and made their way through the snow-covered streets to the church. Father Dominguez greeted them at the door, his face solemn. "You have chosen godparents?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes, Father," Miguel said firmly. "Isabella's cousin Elena will be the godmother, and we have asked Thomas Blackwood to serve as godfather." The priest's face darkened. "I cannot allow that man to participate in this holy sacrament, Miguel. You don't understand what you're doing." "With respect, Father," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart, "it is our right as parents to choose our child's godparents. Mr. Blackwood has been—" generous to our family. We wish to honor him with this role." Father Dominguez pulled Miguel aside, speaking in a harsh whisper. "That man is not what he seems, Miguel. There are rumors, dark rumors about what happens to those who enter his service." "We are not entering his service," Miguel insisted. "We are simply asking him to be Antonio's godfather. A symbolic role, nothing more." The priest searched Miguel's face, seeming to recognize the desperation there. "Very well," he said finally. "But remember, Miguel, a baptism is not just water and words. It is a covenant with God. Be very careful what other covenants you make today." As the church bell tolled noon, the small baptismal party gathered around the font. Elena, Isabella's cousin, stood nervously adjusting her shawl. And there, as if he had materialized from the shadows, stood Thomas Blackwood, immaculate in a black suit with a silver watch chain across his vest. "Shall we begin?" Father Dominguez asked, his voice tight with disapproval. As the priest began the ancient ritual, Miguel couldn't help but notice how Blackwood's dark eyes never left Antonio's face, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When it came time for the godparents to make their promises, Blackwood spoke the words with a conviction that sent a chill down Miguel's spine. "I will," Blackwood said, his voice resonating through the small church. "Watch over this child all the days of his life." Spring arrived in Denver with its usual caprice. Warm, golden days, interspersed with sudden blizzards that reminded everyone that winter never truly surrendered in the shadow of the Rockies. For the Ortega family, each passing day brought a cautious joy. Antonio thrived where his siblings had faltered, growing plump and strong, his cries lusty and demanding. "It's a miracle," Isabella whispered one evening as they watched him sleep in the small cradle Miguel had crafted. "He hasn't been sick once, not even a sniffle." Miguel nodded, though the word miracle stuck in his throat. They had not seen Thomas Blackwood since the baptism, but his presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of their consciousness. Occasionally, Miguel would catch a glimpse of a tall figure in a black suit on the street, or hear whispers from other Mexican families about El Padrino's latest godchild. Then, on the day of Antonio's first birthday, a package arrived, delivered by a solemn-faced boy who disappeared before Miguel could question him. Inside the exquisitely wrapped box was a silver rattle, clearly expensive, with Antonio's name and birth date engraved on the handle. "He remembers," Isabella said, turning the rattle over in her hands. "After a year, he remembers." A note accompanied the gift, written in an elegant flowing script. "My dear godson, congratulations on your first year. I look forward to visiting you on this special day. Expect me at sunset." Your loving godfather, Thomas Blackwood. Miguel and Isabella exchanged alarmed glances. In the year since the baptism, they had managed to push the strange bargain to the back of their minds, focusing instead on the joy of having a healthy child. Now, reality crashed back upon them. "We can't let him in," Isabella said, clutching the note. "Miguel, I have a bad feeling about this." Miguel took the note from her trembling hands. "We made a deal, Isabella, and he has kept his end of it. Antonio is alive, healthy. We owe him at least the courtesy of a visit." The day passed in anxious preparation. Isabella cleaned their modest apartment until it gleamed, prepared a special meal they could ill afford, and dressed Antonio in his finest clothes, the ones usually reserved for Sunday Mass. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the city, a knock came at their door. Miguel opened it to find Thomas Blackwood, looking exactly as he had a year ago, not a hair out of place despite the brisk spring wind. "Mr. Ortega," Blackwood said with a slight bow, "how kind of you to receive me." "Please, come in," Miguel said, stepping aside. "And thank you for the gift. It was very generous." Blackwood entered, removing his hat to reveal hair as black as a raven's wing. His dark eyes immediately sought out Antonio, who sat on a blanket on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. "My godson," Blackwood said, his voice softening. "May I?" Before either parent could respond, he crossed to Antonio and knelt beside him. To their surprise, Antonio showed no fear of the stranger. Instead, he looked up with curious eyes and offered Blackwood a block. "Thank you, young man," Blackwood said gravely, accepting the toy. "A builder, are you? A good profession, though I suspect you may be destined for greater things." For the next hour, Blackwood was the model guest, complimenting Isabella's cooking, inquiring after Miguel's work in the mines, and displaying a surprising knowledge of their extended family back in Mexico. He played with Antonio, speaking to the child as if he were an adult capable of understanding every word. It was only as he prepared to leave that the atmosphere shifted. Blackwood stood by the door, putting on his hat and gloves, when he paused and turned to them with a more serious expression. "Antonio will need certain advantages as he grows," he said. "Education, opportunities. I've taken the liberty of opening an account at the First National Bank in his name. You'll find the details in this envelope." He handed Miguel a sealed letter. "I expect you to use it for his benefit." Miguel stared at the envelope. "Mr. Blackwood, this is too much. We cannot accept—" "You already accepted my help a year ago, Mr. Ortega," Blackwood interrupted, his voice carrying a sudden chill. "This is simply part of what that entails. I take my responsibilities as godfather very seriously." Isabella stepped forward, her fear overcome by maternal instinct. "And what do you expect in return for this generosity, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Only what any godfather would expect. To be part of the child's life, to guide him, to visit on special occasions." He looked down at Antonio, who had crawled to his feet and was reaching up with chubby hands. "And perhaps, when he's old enough, to teach him certain skills that I possess." Miguel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring evening. "What kind of skills?" Blackwood bent down, and to their astonishment, Antonio allowed himself to be picked up without protest. The child even reached out to touch Blackwood's face with curious fingers. "That will depend on Antonio's aptitudes," Blackwood said, bouncing the child gently. "Every child is different. Every bargain is unique." "We made no bargain beyond your role as godfather," Miguel said firmly. Blackwood's smile widened. "Didn't we? You asked for his life, Mr. Ortega, his health, and I delivered." He handed Antonio back to Isabella. "In my experience, life is a series of exchanges. Value for value. I've given something precious to you. In time, Antonio will provide something of value to me." Before they could question him further, Blackwood tipped his hat and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Through the window they watched his tall figure move down the street, eventually disappearing into the shadows between gas lamps. Isabella clutched Antonio to her chest, her face pale. "Miguel, what have we done?" Miguel looked down at the envelope in his hand, torn between dread and a desperate hope that perhaps the price would not be as terrible as they feared. "We kept him alive," Miguel whispered. "For now, that has to be enough." The years passed with the relentless rhythm of the seasons, each one marked by Antonio's growth and Thomas Blackwood's punctual visits. The godfather never failed to appear on Antonio's birthday, bearing gifts that became increasingly valuable and sophisticated as the boy aged. Books in English, Latin, and Greek, mathematical instruments, small mechanical devices that Antonio would disassemble and reassemble with uncanny skill. By the age of 10, Antonio Ortega stood out sharply from the other children in Ortega. While his peers wore patch clothing and struggled through rudimentary schooling when they weren't working alongside their parents, Antonio attended a prestigious private academy on the other side of Denver, dressed in tailored suits that mimicked his godfather's impeccable style. The arrangement had brought the Ortega family a measure of prosperity. Miguel no longer descended into the silver mines, but worked as a foreman for a construction company, overseeing crews of his former peers. Isabella gave piano lessons to the daughters of middle-class families, having herself learned to play on an upright piano that had mysteriously appeared in their new, larger home on Antonio's 5th birthday. Yet despite these comforts, a shadow hung over them, a debt they could feel accruing interest with each passing year, though its exact nature remained unspecified. On a crisp autumn afternoon in 1909, as golden leaves swirled through the streets of Denver, Antonio returned from school to find Thomas Blackwood waiting in their parlor, engaged in quiet conversation with his parents. The tension in the room was palpable. "Ah, there he is," Blackwood said, rising from his chair. "Antonio, my boy, how was school today?" Antonio, now a serious-faced child with intelligent eyes that seemed older than his years, set down his satchel of books. "We discussed the Roman conquest of Britain, Godfather. I found their strategies quite fascinating." "Did you indeed?" Blackwood smiled. "Then you'll enjoy what I have planned for us today. Your parents have agreed that you may accompany me for the afternoon. We have matters to discuss, man to man." Antonio looked to his parents. Miguel's face was a mask of carefully controlled concern, while Isabella seemed on the verge of tears. "It's all right, Antonio," Miguel said, his voice strained. "Mr. Blackwood feels it's time for you to learn more about his work. We'll be back before dark," Blackwood promised, placing a hand on Antonio's shoulder. "Ready your coat, boy. The autumn air has a bite to it today." As they left the house, Antonio glanced back to see his mother clutching her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. Blackwood's carriage, a sleek black affair drawn by two matching ebony horses, waited at the curb. The driver, a silent man with skin so pale it was almost translucent, opened the door without acknowledging either of them. "Where are we going, Godfather?" Antonio asked as the carriage set off through the streets of Denver. "To my home," Blackwood replied. "It's time you saw where and how I live. After all, you're approaching an age where certain decisions must be made about your future." Blackwood's home proved to be a surprise. Rather than the elegant mansion Antonio had imagined, they arrived at the same brick building in the Bottoms where Miguel had first sought out El Padrino a decade ago. The neighborhood had declined further in the intervening years, with many buildings abandoned as Denver's more prosperous citizens moved to newer developments away from the flood-prone areas. "This is where you live?" Antonio asked, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice as they entered the building. Blackwood chuckled. "Appearances, my boy, are often deceiving. A valuable lesson for life." He led Antonio through the familiar office with its leather chairs and bookshelves, but then continued to a door at the back that Antonio's father had never mentioned. Beyond the door lay a different world entirely. The narrow staircase descended into darkness, illuminated only by gas lamps that cast strange, shifting shadows on the stone walls. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying unfamiliar scents, herbs, metals, and something underneath that Antonio couldn't identify, but that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They emerged into a vast chamber that shouldn't have been possible in the modest brick building above. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by columns carved with symbols Antonio recognized from his studies of ancient civilizations. Tables lined the walls, covered with instruments both familiar and bizarre. Microscopes next to crystal balls, modern medical equipment, alongside ancient-looking alchemical apparatus. "Welcome to my true office," Blackwood said, watching Antonio's face closely. "What do you see, boy?" Antonio turned slowly, taking in the impossible room. "I see contradictions, science and something else, something older." Blackwood's smile widened. "Very good. Most children your age would be frightened or confused. But not you. You see with clear eyes." He gestured to a chair beside a large table. "Sit. We have much to discuss." For the next several hours, Blackwood showed Antonio things that defied his young but well-educated understanding of the world. He demonstrated principles of chemistry that seemed to border on magic, conducted electrical experiments that made Antonio's hair stand on end, and showed him books written in languages that had been dead for millennia. "Your mind is exceptional, Antonio," Blackwood said, as the boy pored over a text filled with strange diagrams. "You absorb knowledge like a sponge. It's a rare gift, one that should be nurtured properly. Is that why you've paid for my education? Antonio asked, looking up from the book. Because I'm smart? Blackwood sat across from him, steepling his fingers in that characteristic gesture Antonio had come to know well. Partly, but more importantly, because you have potential. Potential that your circumstances of birth would have wasted. Because my parents are poor immigrants? There was a defensive edge to Antonio's voice. Not at all, Blackwood said smoothly. Because they lack the knowledge to guide a mind like yours. Just as a diamond requires a skilled cutter to reveal its brilliance, you require the right mentor. And that's you? My mentor? I am your godfather, Blackwood corrected, a role with deeper significance than most modern people understand. In ancient times, a godparent was responsible not just for a child's spiritual welfare, but for their entire education, for shaping them into the person they were meant to become. Antonio frowned. And what am I meant to become? Blackwood leaned forward, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. My successor, perhaps, or something greater still. That depends on choices yet to be made. He rose and crossed to a cabinet, returning with a small wooden box. For now, though, I have a task for you. A test, if you will. Inside the box lay what appeared to be a simple puzzle. Wooden pieces that needed to be arranged into a specific pattern. Solve this by our next meeting, Blackwood instructed, without help from anyone else. If you succeed, we'll move on to more interesting challenges. As the carriage returned Antonio to his home that evening, the boy clutched the wooden box to his chest, his mind racing with everything he had seen and heard. Part of him was excited by the intellectual stimulation, the promise of knowledge beyond what his schoolmasters could provide. But another part, a small, quiet voice that sounded strangely like his mother's prayers, whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. When he entered the house, his parents were waiting, their faces anxious in the lamplight. What happened? Miguel asked immediately. What did he show you? Antonio hesitated, suddenly understanding that he stood at a crossroads. Whatever he said now would set him on a path toward Blackwood and his mysteries, or away from them. Just his office, Father, Antonio said carefully. We talked about my studies. He gave me a puzzle to solve. He didn't mention the underground chamber, the impossible experiments, or Blackwood's hints about his future. Isabella crossed herself. Antonio, you must be careful with that man. The things he knows, the things he can do, they're not natural. Isabella, Miguel warned, glancing at their son. No, Miguel. He's old enough to understand. She knelt before Antonio, taking his hands in hers. We made a choice before you were born. A choice to save your life, but that choice may have consequences. For you. Antonio looked from his mother's fearful face to his father's resigned one. What kind of consequences? Miguel sighed heavily. We don't know exactly, but your godfather never gives without expecting something in return. So far, he has only asked to be part of your education, but someday he may ask for more. Antonio thought of the underground chamber, of Blackwood's talk of potential and succession, and when he does, what then? His parents exchanged a look laden with 10 years of accumulated dread. When that day comes, Miguel said slowly, you'll have to make your own choice. Aunt Antonio grew into adolescence with the peculiar duality that defined his existence. School days spent among Denver's elite at the academy, weekends divided between his parents' modest home and Blackwood's mysterious underground laboratory. The wooden puzzle had been only the first of many tests his godfather set for him, each more challenging than the last, each revealing new facets of knowledge that existed in the shadowy borderlands between science and something far older. By his 14th birthday in 1913, Antonio had mastered languages most scholars spent lifetimes studying, understood principles of chemistry and physics that would not be taught in universities for decades, and developed an intuitive grasp of human psychology that allowed him to read people's intentions with unnerving accuracy. All the while, Thomas Blackwood remained unchanged, his face unmarked by the passage of years, his dark eyes still burning with the same intensity they had when he'd stood at Antonio's baptismal font. If Antonio's parents noticed this unnatural preservation, they never spoke of it, though Isabella's rosary beads clicked with increasing frequency whenever Blackwood's name was mentioned. The reckoning they had long feared arrived on a summer evening in 1913. Antonio returned home from a day at Blackwood's laboratory to find his godfather already seated in their parlor, engaged in serious conversation with his parents. All three fell silent when he entered. "Antonio," Blackwood said, rising from his chair, "perfect timing. We were just discussing your future." Miguel's face was ashen, while Isabella's eyes were red-rimmed from recent tears. Antonio felt a chill despite the summer heat. "What about my future?" he asked, setting down the books Blackwood had lent him. "You're approaching an age where decisions must be made," Blackwood said smoothly. "Your academic record is exemplary. You could attend any university in the country, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, but I believe your education requires a more specialized approach." "What kind of approach?" Antonio asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I want you to come live with me," Blackwood said, "as my formal apprentice. Your parents and I have been discussing the arrangements." Antonio looked to his parents. "And what do you think of this idea?" Miguel couldn't meet his son's eyes. "Mr. Blackwood feels it would be best for your development." "I didn't ask what Mr. Blackwood thinks," Antonio said sharply. "I asked what you think." Isabella broke her silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "We think you should have a choice, Antonio, a real choice." Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "I'm afraid the time for choices is past. We made our arrangement 14 years ago." "An arrangement about being his godfather," Miguel said, finding his courage. "Not about taking our son from us." "Semantics," Blackwood dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The role of godfather carries certain traditional rights, especially when the godfather has done so much to ensure the child's welfare." His dark eyes fixed on Antonio. "You've benefited from my patronage your entire life, boy. Your education, your family's improved circumstances, even your very existence, all due to my intervention. Now it's time to begin repaying that debt." Antonio felt a sudden anger rising within him, not just at Blackwood, but at his parents for making this bargain before he was even born, at the unfairness of having his life predetermined by others' decisions. "And if I refuse?" he asked, meeting Blackwood's gaze directly. Something dangerous flashed in the godfather's eyes. "Then the terms of our arrangement would be violated, and the benefits I've provided could be withdrawn." "You mean you'd let him die after all these years?" Isabella gasped. Blackwood didn't look at her, his focus entirely on Antonio. "Not necessarily, but actions have consequences. Debts must be paid one way or another." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Antonio thought of the experiments he'd witnessed in Blackwood's laboratory, the demonstrations of power that defied conventional explanation. He had no doubt his godfather could make good on his implied threat. "How long?" Antonio asked finally. "How long would this apprenticeship last?" 7 years, Blackwood replied without hesitation, "from 14 to 21. The traditional period for mastering any significant body of knowledge. After that, you would be free to make your own way in the world, with abilities few men could imagine." Miguel stood up suddenly. "This is madness. We're talking about our son, not some medieval arrangement. This is America 1913. People don't apprentice their children to whatever you are." Blackwood turned to him with a cold smile. "Mr. Ortega, people make all manner of arrangements when the stakes are high enough. And I assure you, the stakes here are considerably higher than you imagine." He returned his attention to Antonio. "You have until midnight to decide. I'll await your answer at my office." With that, Blackwood collected his hat and cane, nodding curtly to the family before letting himself out. The door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the modest home. As soon as he was gone, Isabella rushed to Antonio, embracing him tightly. "You don't have to go with him," she insisted, her voice trembling. "We'll find another way." Antonio gently disentangled himself from his mother's arms. "What exactly did you promise him when you made this arrangement?" Miguel sank heavily into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 40 years. "We promised nothing specific. He asked only to be your godfather, but we both knew, that there would be a price eventually. We were desperate, Antonio. 4 children we had buried. We couldn't bear to lose another. So you made a deal with a man you knew was dangerous," Antonio said, his voice flat. "A man Father Dominguez warned you about." "Yes," Miguel admitted. "God forgive us, but yes." Antonio paced the small parlor, his mind working furiously. "These past years in his laboratory, he's been preparing me for this, testing me. The languages, the sciences, the psychological exercises, all of it leading to this moment." "What does he do in that place?" Isabella asked. "What has he shown you?" Antonio hesitated. He had never fully described to his parents the wonders and terrors he had witnessed in Blackwood's underground domain. "He has knowledge that shouldn't be possible. He understands principles that science hasn't discovered yet. And he has abilities that defy explanation." "Black magic," Isabella whispered, crossing herself. "No," Antonio said. "At least, not entirely. It's more complex than that. He stands at some intersection between modern science and ancient traditions. He calls it the synthesis, the point where seemingly contradictory systems of knowledge reveal their common truths." Miguel leaned forward. "And he wants to teach you these truths?" "Yes. He says I have an aptitude for it, that my mind works in ways that most people's don't." Antonio stopped pacing and faced his parents. "And the terrible thing is, I want to learn. Part of me is fascinated by what he knows, by what he can do, what I might be able to do." Isabella's face crumpled in distress. "Antonio, please. Whatever this man offers, it comes with a cost to your soul." "Maybe," Antonio acknowledged. "But what's the alternative? If I refuse, he could take everything, your improved circumstances, my education, my health." He didn't voice his darkest fear, that Blackwood might have the power to simply reclaim the life he had preserved, snuffing it out as easily as blowing out a candle. The hours ticked by as they debated, argued, and finally prayed together. A family united in fear, but divided in their understanding of the situation. As midnight approached, Antonio made his decision. "I have to go," he said, rising from the dinner table where they had been sitting in somber discussion. "At least to give him my answer in person. I owe him that much." "We're coming with you," Miguel insisted. Antonio shook his head. "No, this is between him and me now. It's my life, my future, and in the end, it has to be my choice." He embraced his parents, breathing in his mother's familiar scent of rosewater and candle wax, feeling the calluses on his father's hands as they gripped his shoulders. Then, before his courage could fail him, he stepped out into the Denver night. The streets were nearly empty as he made his way to the bottoms. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting sharp shadows across his path. By the time he reached Blackwood's building, the nearby church bells were beginning to toll midnight. The door opened before he could knock. Blackwood stood framed in the doorway, still dressed in the same impeccable suit he had worn earlier, showing no signs of the late hour. "You've made your decision," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I have conditions," Antonio replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Conditions? How interesting. Please, come in." The familiar office was lit only by a single lamp, and the moonlight streaming through the windows. Blackwood gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where Miguel had sat 14 years earlier. "I will accept your apprenticeship," Antonio said once they were seated, "but on these terms, my parents remain safe and prosperous, regardless of how our arrangement proceeds. I have one day each week to visit them, and at the end of the 7 years, I am truly free to choose my own path, even if that path leads away from whatever you're planning for me." Blackwood studied him, those dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. "You've developed a backbone, boy. Good. Spineless apprentices are tedious." He leaned forward. "I accept your first 2 conditions without reservation. Your parents will continue to enjoy my protection, and you may visit them on Sundays. But the 3rd condition, that requires clarification." "What do you mean?" "At the end of 7 years, you will indeed be free to choose your path," Blackwood said carefully. "But that choice will be made with full knowledge of what you're accepting or rejecting. You can't truly choose to walk away from something you don't fully understand." Antonio felt a chill at the precise way Blackwood phrased his words. "And what exactly would I be accepting or rejecting?" "The power," Blackwood said simply. "Knowledge. A lineage that stretches back through history, through civilizations whose very names have been forgotten. I am part of a tradition, Antonio. A tradition that must be passed on to those with the capacity to receive it. And you think I have that capacity. I know you do. I've been testing you since you were a child." Blackwood rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the moonlit city. "Denver is young, barely 50 years old, but I am not. And what I carry is far older still." A suspicion that had been forming in Antonio's mind for years suddenly crystallized. "How old are you, really?" Blackwood turned, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the silver moonlight. "I was born in London in 1723. I have had many names, many identities since then. Thomas Blackwood is merely the most recent." Antonio felt his world tilt, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly shifted. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Blackwood smiled. "You've seen enough in my laboratory to know that the boundaries of possible are far more flexible than most people believe. Longevity is merely one application of the knowledge I possess, knowledge I'm offering to share with you. Immortality," Antonio whispered. "That's what you're offering." "Extended life," Blackwood corrected. "Nothing is truly immortal. But yes, a life measured in centuries rather than decades. Time enough to learn, to master disciplines that ordinary humans can only scratch the surface of in their brief existence. And in exchange, what do you get from this arrangement?" Blackwood returned to his desk, sitting down with fluid grace. "Continuation. Someone to carry what I know into the future. Someone with the intellectual capacity and moral flexibility to use this knowledge responsibly." "Moral flexibility," Antonio repeated, not liking the sound of that phrase. "The ability to see beyond conventional notions of right and wrong," Blackwood explained. "To make decisions based on a longer view of history and human development. The work I do, we do, sometimes requires difficult choices." Antonio thought of the strange experiments he had witnessed, the books written in blood rather than ink, the whispered names of entities that Blackwood sometimes consulted. What happens at the end of 7 years exactly? What is the final step in becoming your successor? Blackwood's expression became guarded. "That is something you will learn when you're ready, not before." He extended his hand across the desk. "Do we have an agreement, Antonio? Will you accept my teaching with the conditions you've specified?" Antonio stared at the offered hand. In that moment, he thought of his parents, their sacrifice, their fear, their love. He thought of the 4 siblings he had never known, their tiny crosses in the cemetery. He thought of all he had learned already from this strange ancient being who called himself his Godfather, and he thought of all that remained to be discovered. Secrets of life and death, of time and space, of powers that defied modern understanding. "Yes," he said finally, taking Blackwood's hand. "We have an agreement." Blackwood's grip was cold and dry, like the touch of parchment. "Then it begins tonight. Pack your belongings. Say your goodbyes. You'll move into my home tomorrow." As Antonio rose to leave, A thought struck him. The baptism, he said suddenly. You needed to be my godfather specifically. Why? What power did that give you? For the first time that night, Blackwood looked surprised. Very good. You're already asking the right questions. His smile widened. Baptism is a ritual of dedication, of consecration. Being named your godfather in a church before God and witnesses created a bond between us, a channel through which certain influences could flow. The church believes such rituals have power. They're right, though not in the way they imagine. Antonio felt a chill run down his spine. So when Father Dominguez baptized me and named you my godfather, he unknowingly completed an ancient ritual far older than Christianity, Blackwood finished for him. One that has served my purposes many times through the centuries. El Padrino, the Godfather, is more than just a colorful nickname, Antonio. It's one of the oldest roles in the long game I play. And how many other godchildren have you had? Antonio asked, dreading the answer. Blackwood's expression became distant, as if looking back across vast stretches of time. Many. Some succeeded, some failed. Some chose different paths at their moment of decision. His focus returned to Antonio. Each story is unique. Yours is still being written. With those ominous words hanging in the air, Antonio left the building, stepping back into the moonlit streets of Denver. The church bells had finished tolling midnight. A new day had begun, the first day of his 7-year apprenticeship to a man who had walked the earth for nearly 2 centuries. As he made his way home to tell his parents of his decision, Antonio couldn't escape the feeling that he had just signed away far more than 7 years of his life. The transition from son to apprentice proved more abrupt than Antonio had anticipated. The morning after his agreement with Blackwood, he arrived at the brick building in the Bottoms with a single suitcase containing his clothes and a few precious books. His parents had wept at his departure, though they had respected his decision, understanding better than most the consequences of refusing Blackwood's offer. "Your quarters," Blackwood said, leading him not down to the underground laboratory, but up a narrow staircase to the building's 2nd floor. The room was small but comfortable, with a bed, desk, wardrobe, and a window overlooking the shabby neighborhood. "You'll find appropriate clothing in the wardrobe. Your old things won't be necessary." The wardrobe contained exact replicas of Blackwood's own attire, black suits of impeccable cut, white shirts, vests, and ties, all sized perfectly for Antonio's adolescent frame. The message was clear: he was to become Blackwood in miniature, at least in appearance. "Your education begins immediately," Blackwood continued. "You've shown aptitude in your previous studies, but those were merely preparatory. Now we move to more substantive matters." For the next 3 years, Antonio lived a life of almost monastic discipline. He rose before dawn each day, spent hours in study of ancient texts, practiced chemical and alchemical procedures under Blackwood's exacting supervision, and endured psychological exercises designed to stretch his mind beyond normal human limitations. The only break in this routine came on Sundays, when Antonio was permitted to visit his parents. These visits became increasingly strained as the gulf between his new life and his old one widened. His parents noticed the changes in him. His more formal speech, his distant gaze, the way he sometimes seemed to be listening to voices they couldn't hear. "He's changing you," Isabella said one Sunday afternoon in 1916, as Antonio prepared to return to Blackwood's. At 17, Antonio had grown tall and lean, his features sharpening into those of a young man. "You look more like him every day." "It's just the clothes, Mother," Antonio replied, though he avoided the mirror as he spoke. He knew what she meant. It wasn't just his appearance that was transforming. "No," she insisted, "it's something in your eyes, something cold." She clutched his hands. "Are you still praying, Antonio? Do you still go to Mass?" He gently extracted his hands from hers. "Blackwood's teachings encompass many traditions, many beliefs. I'm exploring perspectives beyond what Father Dominguez taught us. Miguel, who had been listening silently, spoke up. What exactly is he teaching you, son? All these years, and you've never really told us. Antonio hesitated. How could he explain the rituals that allowed him to perceive the layered realities behind the visible world? The formulas that could bend probability like soft metal? The languages that, when spoken correctly, could command attention from entities that existed in the spaces between conventional dimensions? It's difficult to explain, he said finally. It's a synthesis of many disciplines: science, philosophy, certain spiritual traditions. Black magic, Isabella whispered as she had that night years ago. This time, Antonio didn't contradict her. Knowledge isn't black or white, Mother. It simply is. How it's used determines its moral quality. And how does Blackwood use it? Miguel asked sharply. Again, Antonio hesitated. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure. Blackwood conducted business with a wide array of clients, from wealthy industrialists seeking advantage over competitors to desperate people like his parents had been, looking for solutions to problems that conventional methods couldn't solve. What exactly transpired in those private consultations, Antonio wasn't permitted to know, though he sometimes heard strange sounds through the walls or glimpsed haunted expressions on the faces of those who left Blackwood's office. He helps people, Antonio said, the words sounding hollow even to himself, in his own way. The 4th year of his apprenticeship marked a turning point. On Antonio's 18th birthday, Blackwood presented him with a key, small, silver, intricately wrought. You've progressed sufficiently to be trusted with certain responsibilities, Blackwood explained. This opens a room on the 3rd floor. A room where I conduct special consultations. From now on, you will assist me with these clients. The room proved to be a revelation. Unlike the scientific atmosphere of the underground laboratory, this chamber was arranged for ritual purposes. A perfect circle inscribed on the floor, strange symbols adorning the walls, and artifacts from a dozen ancient cultures displayed in glass cases around the perimeter. What happens here? Antonio asked, taking in the peculiar arrangement. Negotiations, Blackwood replied cryptically. The most important kind. That evening, Antonio observed his first special consultation. The client was a middle-aged woman dressed in expensive mourning clothes, her face lined with grief. My son, she explained to Blackwood, her voice breaking. The doctors say the consumption will take him within the month. I've tried everything, specialists from Europe, experimental treatments. Nothing works. They say it's hopeless. Blackwood listened impassively. Medical science has its limitations. Fortunately, there are alternatives. He gestured to Antonio. My apprentice will prepare what we need. Following Blackwood's murmured instructions, Antonio arranged certain items within the circle. Candles of a specific composition, herbs burned in precise combinations, liquids mixed in ratios that seemed to follow some mathematical progression he didn't yet understand. When all was ready, Blackwood invited the woman to sit within the circle. There is a price, he warned her. There's always a price for circumventing the natural order. Anything, the woman said immediately. Money is no object. It's not money I require, Blackwood said. Rather, a commitment. Your son will live, will recover fully from his illness. In exchange, when he reaches the age of 21, he will perform a service for me, a specific task which I will reveal at that time. The woman hesitated only briefly. Yes, whatever it takes. The ritual that followed shook Antonio to his core. Blackwood spoke words in languages Antonio had studied but never heard pronounced aloud, manipulated energies that made the air itself seem to warp and bend, and finally extracted what appeared to be a contract written in script that shifted and changed as Antonio tried to read it. The woman signed in ink that looked suspiciously like blood. 3 days later, Denver newspapers reported the miraculous recovery of the son of one of the city's most prominent families. The boy who had been at death's door was suddenly well, his lungs clear, his strength returning with unnatural speed. That night Antonio confronted Blackwood in the underground laboratory. "What did you do? What was that ritual?" Blackwood looked up from the ancient text he was studying. "I saved a boy's life, just as I saved yours all those years ago." "And the price? This service he'll perform when he's 21? "That is between the client and myself," Blackwood said dismissively. "You needn't concern yourself with the details." "But I'm your apprentice," Antonio pressed. "If I'm to learn your methods, don't I need to understand all aspects of them?" Blackwood regarded him with those fathomless dark eyes. "There are levels to this knowledge, Antonio. You're not ready for certain aspects." "Not yet. When will I be ready? What exactly are you preparing me for?" For a moment, something like genuine emotion flickered across Blackwood's usually impassive face, a mixture of anticipation and what might have been regret. "At the end of your 7th year," he said finally, "on your 21st birthday. Then you'll understand everything." The final years of Antonio's apprenticeship passed in a blur of increasingly advanced studies and more frequent participation in Blackwood's special consultations. With each ritual, each contract signed, each seemingly impossible problem solved through Blackwood's methods, Antonio felt himself being drawn deeper into a web whose full dimensions he still couldn't perceive. By early 1920, as his 21st birthday approached, Antonio had assisted in dozens of these transactions. He had watched Blackwood cure incurable diseases, reveal the locations of lost fortunes, ensure the success of business ventures, and even, on one memorable occasion, alter the weather patterns over Colorado to end a devastating drought. Each miracle came with its price, its contract, its future service to be rendered. Blackwood kept meticulous records of these arrangements in ledgers bound in leather that felt disturbingly like human skin. The nature of these services remained mysterious. Occasionally, past clients would return to Blackwood's office, be led to the ritual room on the 3rd floor, and emerge hours later looking haunted but relieved, as if some terrible burden had finally been discharged. "They're fulfilling their contracts," Blackwood explained when Antonio questioned him. "Paying their debts." "By doing what exactly?" "Various things. Each contract is unique, tailored to the individual and the service rendered." Blackwood's tone made it clear that further questions would not be welcomed. As the years passed, Antonio's Sunday visits to his parents grew less frequent and more strained. Miguel and Isabella watched with poorly disguised horror as their son transformed into something they barely recognized, a young man with knowledge behind his eyes that no 20-year-old should possess, who spoke of concepts that made their Catholic faith seem simplistic, even naive. "You never laugh anymore," Isabella observed during one of his rare visits in early 1920. "You never speak of friends, of girls, of normal things a young man should care about." "My studies leave little time for such distractions," Antonio replied. "Distractions," Miguel repeated incredulously. "Antonio, this is life you're talking about. Real life, not whatever Blackwood is teaching you in that place." Antonio had no answer for them. The truth was, normal human concerns did seem increasingly trivial compared to the vistas of knowledge and power Blackwood had opened before him. What was an evening at a dance hall compared to learning how to perceive the underlying mathematical patterns of reality? What was a fleeting romance next to understanding how to manipulate the very forces that governed life and death? Yet as his 21st birthday drew nearer, the day Blackwood had promised would reveal the ultimate purpose of his apprenticeship, Antonio found himself increasingly troubled by dark dreams and nagging doubts. What exactly was Blackwood preparing him for? What was the final transformation that awaited him? The answers began to emerge 3 days before his birthday, when Blackwood summoned him to the underground laboratory late at night. "It's time you learned the full truth of our work," Blackwood said, unlocking a heavy iron door that Antonio had never seen opened before. the true source of the power we wield. Beyond the door lay a small circular chamber, its walls covered in mirrors that reflected and multiplied the light of a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on the pedestal rested a book, ancient beyond imagining, its cover made of some dark material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light. "The Liber Umbrarum," Blackwood said reverently, "the Book of Shadows, my most precious possession and soon yours." Antonio approached cautiously. The book emanated a palpable aura, a sense of age and power that made the air around it seem heavier, more substantial. "What is it exactly?" "A record," Blackwood replied. "A catalogue of every contract, every bargain, every exchange I have brokered over the centuries, and more importantly, the source of my extended life." With careful hands, Blackwood opened the book. The pages within were filled with names, thousands upon thousands of names, written in different inks, different hands, different alphabets spanning the breadth of human history. "Each name represents a life touched by my work," Blackwood explained. "A bargain struck, a service rendered, a price paid." Antonio's eyes widened as he began to recognize names from more recent pages. Clients he had helped Blackwood serve over the past 7 years. And there, on a page near the beginning of the book, he saw his own name, Antonio Ortega, written in an ink that seemed to shimmer with a reddish tint. "My parents' bargain," he whispered. "Yes," Blackwood confirmed. "The arrangement that saved your life and brought you to me." He turned more pages, revealing names that stretched back decades, centuries. "Every name here represents a portion of life energy, willingly given, though few understand exactly what they're offering when they sign our contracts." Antonio looked up sharply. "Life energy? How do you imagine I've lived for nearly 2 centuries?" Blackwood asked. "How do you think I perform what appears to be magic? There is power in life, Antonio, in its creation, its duration, its ending. When someone signs one of our contracts, they bind a portion of their life force to our work. When they fulfill the contract by performing their service, that portion is transferred." Horror began to dawn on Antonio. "Transferred to you?" "To the keeper of the book," Blackwood corrected. "For nearly 200 years, that has been me. 3 days from now, on your 21st birthday, it will be you." Antonio stepped back from the book, from Blackwood. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that you will become El Padrino," Blackwood said, his dark eyes gleaming with an inner fire. "You will take possession of the Liber Umbrarum, assume my identity, my role, my power, and I will finally be released from this burden." "And, released? You mean death?" Blackwood said simply. "True death at last. 2 centuries is long enough, Antonio. Too long, perhaps. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched revolutions transform the world, observed humanity's endless capacity to repeat its follies. I'm tired. It's time for new blood, your blood, to take up the mantle." Antonio felt as if the floor were tilting beneath him. "And if I refuse? If I choose another path, as you promised I could?" Blackwood's expression hardened. "There is no other path, not anymore. You've gone too far, learned too much. The book has already marked you as my successor." He pointed to Antonio's name on the ancient page. "See how it glows? The transfer has already begun." Antonio looked down at his hands, noticing for the first time a subtle change in his skin, a new translucence, as if something essential was being drawn out of him and into the book. "This can't be right. You promised me a choice." "I promised you would make your choice with full knowledge," Blackwood corrected. "Now you have that knowledge. You will become El Padrino, or you will die. Those are the only possibilities remaining." Antonio backed toward the door. "I need to think, to talk to my parents." Blackwood's face twisted into an expression Antonio had never seen before, a mixture of pity and cold determination. "By all means, take your time, visit your parents, say your goodbyes, but understand this, on the night of your 21st birthday, you will return here. You will place your hands upon the Liber Umbrarum, and you will either accept your destiny or perish in refusing it." Antonio fled the underground chamber, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had learned. As he emerged into the cold night air, he realized that the man he had called Godfather for 21 years had been preparing him not for independence, not for mastery, but for sacrifice. Either the sacrifice of his humanity in becoming the next keeper of that terrible book, or the sacrifice of his life in refusing. He had 3 days to decide which price he was willing to pay. The Ortega family home was quiet when Antonio arrived, having walked the familiar route from the Bottoms in a state of numb shock. Despite the late hour, a light still burned in the front window, his mother's habit, keeping vigil for his increasingly rare visits. Isabella opened the door before he could knock, as if she had sensed his approach. "Antonio, what's wrong?" Her face, lined now with the passing years, immediately registered his distress. "I need to speak with you and Father," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "It's important." Miguel appeared behind her, grey streaking his once black hair, his posture stooped from decades of labor. "Come in, son. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," Antonio murmured, stepping into the warmth of the home he had once shared with them. Around the kitchen table where they had shared countless meals, Antonio revealed everything: the true nature of Blackwood's work, the Book of Shadows, the life energy extracted through contracts, and finally the terrible choice that awaited him on his 21st birthday. "Santa Maria," Isabella whispered, crossing herself repeatedly. "This is devil's work. I knew it. I always knew it." Miguel's face had gone ashen. "And this is what he wanted all along? For you to replace him?" "Yes," Antonio confirmed. "Every test, every lesson, every ritual I witnessed or participated in, all of it was preparation for this. He's been grooming me to take his place since I was born. Since before you were born," Miguel corrected grimly. "When we made our bargain, when we allowed him to become your godfather, that was the first step in his plan." Antonio ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration he had unconsciously adopted from Blackwood. "The question now is what I do about it. If I refuse, he says I'll die. If I accept, I become him. I take over his role, his identity, his unnatural lifespan." "You cannot do this," Isabella said firmly. "Whatever the cost, you cannot damn your soul by taking up this evil work." "Is it evil, though?" Antonio asked, the question surprising even himself. "Blackwood has helped people, cured illnesses, solved problems that seemed impossible. Yes, he extracts a price, but the clients agree willingly." "Do they understand what they're agreeing to?" Miguel challenged. "Did we, when we made our bargain?" Antonio had no answer for that. The contracts were deliberately obscure, couched in language that concealed their true nature. No client fully understood that they were signing away a portion of their life force. "There must be another way," Isabella insisted. "Some way to break this curse." Antonio thought of the ancient book, its pages filled with names spanning centuries. "Perhaps, but I don't know what it is, and we have very little time to find it. My birthday is in 3 days. Miguel stood up suddenly. "Father Dominguez. He warned us about Blackwood years ago. He might know something that could help." "Father Dominguez died 2 years ago," Antonio reminded him gently. "I attended his funeral, remember? But the church remains," Miguel said. "And its records. Father Dominguez kept journals, histories of the parish. If he knew about Blackwood, maybe he wrote something down, something that could help us understand what we're facing." It was a slim hope, but it was more than they had a moment ago. "It's worth trying," Antonio agreed. The rest of the night passed in fitful planning. Antonio would not return to Blackwood's until the night of his birthday. Instead, he would help his parents search for any information that might offer an alternative to the grim choice before him. As dawn broke over Denver, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets, Antonio found himself standing before the small church where he had been baptized 21 years earlier. The building seemed smaller than he remembered, humbler, yet there was a solidity to it that contrasted sharply with the illusory grandeur of Blackwood's domain. The young priest who had replaced Father Dominguez was initially reluctant to allow them access to the parish records, but Miguel's desperate explanation, edited to remove the more supernatural elements, eventually convinced him. Father Dominguez kept everything in the basement, the priest explained, leading them down a narrow staircase. I've been meaning to organize it all, but between the influenza epidemic and the war, there hasn't been time. The basement was a cluttered maze of bookshelves, filing cabinets, and stacked boxes, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The priest lit several lamps, casting a warm glow over the chaos. His personal journals should be here somewhere. He kept them separate from the official parish records. For hours, the three Ortegas searched through the accumulated papers of decades. Antonio found his own baptismal record, noting with a chill the elegant signature of Thomas Blackwood as his godfather. There were other records too, baptisms, marriages, funerals, that charted the life of Denver's Mexican community through the years. It was Isabella who finally found what they were seeking, a small, leather-bound journal tucked inside a larger book of parish accounts. The journal was written in Father Dominguez's spidery hand, switching between Spanish, Latin, and English as his thoughts required. "Look," she said, pointing to an entry dated just after Antonio's baptism. "He writes about Blackwood." Antonio took the journal, translating the Spanish aloud for his parents. "Today, I was forced to accept Thomas Blackwood as godfather to the Ortega child. I protested, but the parents insisted, and canon law gives them this right. I fear greatly for this child's future. Blackwood is not what he appears. The stories I have heard from the old country, from my own grandfather, who was a priest in Mexico City, they speak of El Padrino, a figure who appears throughout our history, always the same, yet bearing different names. A man who offers help to the desperate, who performs what seem like miracles, but whose price is ultimately paid in blood." Antonio turned the pages, scanning quickly through entries that documented Father Dominguez's growing concerns, his investigations into local history, his correspondence with clergy in other cities where similar figures had been reported. Then he stopped, his finger tracing a paragraph written in a shaky hand, as if the priest had been greatly disturbed when writing it. "I have discovered the truth of El Padrino, and it is worse than I feared. He is not one man, but many, or rather, a succession of men, each trained by his predecessor, each inheriting some terrible power and burden. The source of this power is said to be a book, El Libro de las Sombras, which contains the names of all who have made bargains with El Padrino through the centuries. The book must be passed on willingly from master to apprentice, but if the apprentice rejects his inheritance, both he and the master are destroyed. The only hope of breaking this chain lies in the book itself being destroyed, but this can only be accomplished through a specific ritual, performed at the moment of transition from one keeper to the next." Antonio's heart raced as he read on, finding Father Dominguez's detailed notes on this ritual, a counter-ceremony that would theoretically nullify the power of the Book of Shadows and release all those bound by its contracts. "This is it," he breathed. "This is how we stop Blackwood." Miguel read over his shoulder. "But look at what it requires, elements that seem impossible to obtain. The blood of an innocent willingly given. Water from a baptismal font mixed with consecrated wine, and it must be performed at the exact moment of transition, when the book is being passed from master to apprentice." "The innocent blood could be mine," Isabella said quietly. "I have never harmed anyone, never broken faith with God. I would give my blood willingly to save my son. And the baptismal water and wine, we can take those from the church," Antonio added, his mind racing with possibilities. "The real challenge will be performing the ritual at the right moment, in Blackwood's own sanctum." They spent the remaining time planning, gathering the necessary elements and memorizing the ritual described in Father Dominguez's journal. Antonio knew he would have only one chance. If Blackwood suspected what he intended, there would be no opportunity to try again. On the night of his 21st birthday, Antonio returned to the brick building in the Bottoms. The streets were quiet, a light snow falling from the overcast sky. He carried a small bag containing the items for Father Dominguez's ritual, a vial of his mother's blood, water from the baptismal font, and consecrated wine, all mixed according to the priest's instructions. Blackwood was waiting for him in the office, dressed in formal attire as if for a significant ceremony. "You've returned," he said, his dark eyes studying Antonio's face. "Have you made your decision?" "I have," Antonio replied, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm ready to learn the final truth of your teachings." Something like satisfaction flickered across Blackwood's features. "Good. I had faith in you, Antonio. From the moment of your baptism, I knew you were the one who would carry on my work." He gestured toward the door, leading down to the underground laboratory. "Shall we proceed?" The laboratory was illuminated by dozens of candles, their flames perfectly still in the airless chamber. The door to the circular mirror room stood open, revealing the pedestal where the Book of Shadows waited. "Before we begin," Antonio said, "I want to understand exactly what will happen. How is the transfer accomplished?" Blackwood moved to the pedestal, resting his hand lightly on the ancient book. "It's quite simple, really. At midnight, you will place your hands upon the book, as I am doing now. I will speak the words of transference, releasing my claim to the power it contains. That power, along with the responsibility of maintaining all existing contracts and creating new ones, will pass to you. I will age rapidly as the accumulated life energy leaves me, returning to my true age of nearly 200 years. Within minutes, I will be dust, and you will begin your new existence as El Padrino. And my parents? They'll remain safe? Healthy?" "Of course," Blackwood assured him. "Their contract will transfer to you along with all the others. You may choose to release them from their obligation if you wish. Once you control the book, you can modify any contract within it." Antonio nodded slowly. "And what of my life? Will I simply disappear as you did, take on new identities through the decades?" "Nah, you'll learn to navigate the practicalities," Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. "I've prepared extensive documentation for your first transition, property deeds, bank accounts, identification papers, everything you'll need to establish yourself elsewhere when the time comes to leave Denver." "You seem to have thought of everything," Antonio said, careful to keep any hint of his true intentions from his voice. Blackwood smiled thinly. "I've had nearly 2 centuries to perfect the process. Now we should prepare ourselves. Midnight approaches." "Udi." As Blackwood turned to make final adjustments to the candles, Antonio slipped his hand into his pocket, feeling the small vial that contained the elements of the counter-ritual. Father Dominguez's journal had been very specific. The mixture had to be applied directly to the book at the exact moment of transference. While reciting an invocation in ancient Spanish that Antonio had memorized over the past 2 days, the mantel clock in the laboratory began to strike midnight. Blackwood stood on one side of the pedestal, gesturing for Antonio to take his place on the opposite side. "Place your hands on the book," Blackwood instructed as the final stroke of midnight sounded. Antonio did as he was told, feeling a strange vibration emanate from the ancient tome. The names on its pages seemed to pulse with an inner light, and he could swear he heard distant whispers, thousands of voices speaking just below the threshold of audibility. Blackwood began to speak in a language Antonio didn't recognize, older than Latin, older perhaps than any language still spoken on Earth. As he did, Antonio felt a curious sensation, as if something were flowing from Blackwood, through the book and into him. A warmth that quickly became a burning, a pressure that built behind his eyes and in his chest. This was the moment. With his right hand still on the book, Antonio used his left to withdraw the vial from his pocket. In one swift motion, he unstopped it and poured the contents onto the open pages of the Liber Umbrarum. "What are you doing?" Blackwood cried, his incantation interrupted. He tried to pull the book away, but Antonio held firm, his right hand seemingly fused to its cover. Antonio began to recite the counter-ritual from Father Dominguez's journal, his voice steady despite the pain now coursing through him. The mixture of blood, baptismal water, and consecrated wine spread across the pages, the names beginning to blur and run together like ink in rain. "Stop!" Blackwood shouted, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You don't understand what you're doing. You'll destroy us both." Antonio continued the invocation, the ancient Spanish words feeling strange yet powerful on his tongue. The book began to smoke where the liquid touched it, the pages curling and blackening. Blackwood lunged across the pedestal, his hands clawing at Antonio's face. "Fool! Do you know how many lives are bound to that book? How many bargains will be broken?" Alas, Antonio fought him off with one arm, while continuing the ritual with the other. "Better that than continuing this cycle of predation," he gasped. "Better that than becoming you." The air in the chamber grew thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The mirrors around them began to crack, jagged lines spreading across their surfaces. The candles flared impossibly high, then guttered out simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. In that darkness, Antonio felt, rather than saw, the Book of Shadows begin to disintegrate beneath his hand. The sensation of burning intensified, spreading up his arm and throughout his body. He heard Blackwood scream, a sound of such primal anguish that it seemed to come from the throat of something no longer human. Then, abruptly, a flash of light so intense it penetrated even Antonio's closed eyelids. A concussive force threw him backward, slamming him into one of the broken mirrors. He felt glass cutting his skin, heard it shattering around him, and then nothing at all. Antonio awoke to the sensation of cold snow on his face. He was lying in an alley beside the ruins of Blackwood's building, which was now engulfed in flames. Firefighters were already on the scene, their shouts echoing through the night as they fought to keep the blaze from spreading to neighboring structures. He struggled to his feet, his body aching with a bone-deep weariness unlike anything he had ever experienced. His right hand was burned, the skin blackened and blistered where it had touched the Book of Shadows. But he was alive. Of Blackwood, there was no sign. Whether the man had been consumed in the destruction of his book or had somehow escaped, Antonio couldn't tell. The underground laboratory was surely destroyed, buried beneath tons of burning debris. He staggered away from the scene, drawing no attention from the firefighters and onlookers focused on the spectacular blaze. His only thought was to reach his parents, to tell them what had happened, to confirm that they were safe. The walk home seemed to take hours, each step an effort of will. Dawn was breaking as he finally reached their door, collapsing against it rather than knocking properly. Isabella opened it, catching him as he fell forward. "Antonio! Miguel, come quickly! It's Antonio!" They carried him to the sofa, where Isabella tended to his burned hand while Miguel prepared hot tea laced with whiskey. Neither asked what had happened. The distant glow of the fire in the bottoms and their son's condition told them enough. "Did it work?" Miguel finally asked, once Antonio had recovered enough to speak. "Is it over?" "I think so," Antonio replied, his voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. "The book, it burned. There was an explosion. There was—" "Blackwood?" He broke off, uncertain how to describe what he had seen and felt in those final moments. "He's gone," Isabella said with certainty. "I can feel it. Whatever hold he had on us, on you, it's broken." Antonio nodded slowly. "But at what cost?" Father Dominguez's journal said that destroying the book would break all the contracts it contained. All those people Blackwood helped over the years, what happens to them now? It was a question that would haunt him in the days and weeks that followed. As he recovered from his injuries, reports began to circulate through Denver of sudden illnesses, accidents, and deaths. people who had been healthy one day and stricken the next. Many were from prominent families, others from the immigrant communities where Blackwood had found most of his clients. The pattern was clear to Antonio, though invisible to everyone else. These were people whose lives had been sustained by bargains recorded in the Book of Shadows. With those bargains now broken, the natural order was reasserting itself. Not all suffered, however. Many of Blackwood's clients showed no ill effects from the breaking of their contracts. Perhaps their bargains had been of a different nature, or perhaps the power of the book had been more complex than even Father Dominguez had understood. Antonio's parents remained healthy, showing no signs of reverting to the desperate circumstances that had driven them to seek El Padrino's help in the first place. Whether this was because Antonio himself had been the subject of their bargain, or because the counter-ritual had somehow preserved certain contracts while breaking others, he couldn't say. What was clear was that Thomas Blackwood, at least in that identity, was gone from Denver. The authorities ruled the fire an accident, finding no bodies in the ruins. The few possessions Antonio had left in his quarters were destroyed, along with all evidence of the strange rituals and ancient knowledge that had been practiced there. A spring arrived in 1921, bringing new life to the city after the long winter. Antonio found himself at a crossroads. The education he had received from Blackwood, stripped of its supernatural elements, still left him with knowledge and skills far beyond his peers. Several universities had expressed interest in the brilliant young man from Denver's Mexican community, offering scholarships that would have been unthinkable before. Yet he hesitated to accept any of these opportunities. Something within him had been changed by his experience, not just the 7 years of Blackwood's tutelage, but the final confrontation, the destruction of the Book of Shadows. He felt both older than his years and strangely unmoored, as if he had been prepared for a destiny that no longer awaited him. One crisp April morning, as cherry blossoms drifted from the trees that lined Denver's newer boulevards, Antonio found himself once again standing before the small church where he had been baptized. On an impulse he entered, finding the young priest arranging flowers on the altar. "Ah, Mr. Ortega," the priest greeted him. "I was wondering if you might return. Did you find what you were looking for in Father Dominguez's journals?" "I did," Antonio replied. "More than I expected, in fact." The priest nodded, seemingly unsurprised. He was a wise man, Father Dominguez. He understood that the battle between light and darkness takes many forms, not all of them recognized by our modern world. Antonio studied the priest more carefully. "You know more about this than you let on when we came asking for his records." A small smile. "I know that Father Dominguez was concerned about certain influences in this city, influences that seem to have diminished recently." He gestured to the pews. "Would you like to talk about it? The seal of confession applies even if you're just seeking counsel rather than absolution." For the first time in years, Antonio felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Here was someone who might understand at least part of what he had experienced. Someone whose perspective wasn't corrupted by the terrible knowledge Blackwood had imparted. "Yes," he said, following the priest to a quiet corner of the church. "I think I would." The conversation that followed lasted hours, extending from morning into afternoon, as Antonio carefully revealed portions of his story, edited to protect the priest from knowledge too dangerous to share fully, but honest enough to provide the guidance he sought. "It seems to me," the priest said finally, "that you were given a rare opportunity. You glimpsed powers and knowledge beyond ordinary human understanding, yet you chose to reject them when you recognized their true cost." "But what do I do now?" Antonio asked. "How do I live a normal life after everything I've seen and learned?" The priest considered this thoughtfully. "Perhaps you're not meant to live an ordinary life. Perhaps your experiences, painful as they were, have prepared you for a different purpose." He leaned forward. Father Dominguez was not just a parish priest. He was part of a larger community, scholars, clergy, and lay people who dedicate themselves to understanding and countering the darker forces in our world, people who stand at the boundary between conventional faith and deeper mysteries. Like Blackwood, but on the side of good? Antonio asked skeptically. Not at all like Blackwood, the priest corrected firmly. Those who serve the light don't make bargains or extract prices. They protect, they heal, they illuminate, without obligation, without contract. Their power comes from grace freely given, not life force extorted through deception. Antonio thought of the counter-ritual, of how it had worked despite Blackwood's certainty that the book could only be transferred, never destroyed. And you think I could be part of this community? I think you've been uniquely prepared for it, the priest said. Few have seen what you've seen and chosen as you chose. That gives you perspective, discernment that others lack. As Antonio left the church that afternoon, the weight of his past still remained, but alongside it grew something new, a sense of purpose, of possibility. Perhaps there was a reason he had endured 7 years as Blackwood's apprentice, a reason he had learned the secrets of El Padrino only to reject them. Perhaps that knowledge, tempered by choice and compassion, could serve a greater good. The sun was setting over Denver as he walked home, casting long shadows across streets that had witnessed so much of his life's strange journey. Behind him, the church bell tolled, marking the hour. Before him stretched a future unknown, but newly hopeful. A life no longer defined by an ancient bargain made before his birth, but by the choices he would make for himself in the days to come. El Padrino was gone. Antonio Ortega remained, and in that simple fact lay a victory more profound than any power the Book of Shadows could have bestowed.